Good day, viewers, listeners. It is the 21st of November, 2018. This is the Social Dynamics Podcast, and I am your host, C.B. Ahern. I have a guest today who I'm sure you will be interested to hear. Her name is Rachel Fulton Brown of the University of Chicago. She is a professor of medieval history, a religious scholar, and an all-around fascinating character. So welcome to the show, Rachel. It's great to have you, and I'm looking forward to getting into a lot of interesting, maybe even controversial topics. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let's be controversial. I like that.
Oh, fantastic. Me too. It's actually my favorite thing is to talk about things that make the general public uncomfortable. I like to make
well, we're talking about religion. That'll do it right there.
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot, like, because you yourself are a Christian, how would you define yourself as far as your religiosity goes?
What do you mean by that? I go to mass on Sundays.
Yeah, would you?
I have a apartment filled with religious art. I think about God and devotion all the time. I mean, which part of religiosity are you thinking of?
I was just wondering, do you consider yourself like generally Christian, like a specific genre of Christianity, such as Catholicism? Do you consider yourself like not traditionally Christian, but you incorporate a lot of ideas and are open to a lot of ideas outside of the Christian corpus, I suppose you could say?
Oh, well, I'll be mischievous. How do I define myself as a Christian? I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again. He ascended into heaven, whence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. Sitteth at the right hand of God, from whence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. Believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting.
Okay, that's pretty.
Will that do? And in fact, that should tell you everything about me as a Christian, that I affirm the faith. And it's interesting. I think there were a number of things embedded, and I hope I said that was the Apostles' Creed, which is the short one. I'm embarrassed to say I can't do the Nicene Creed from memory, but the Apostles' Creed is older, as a part of the tradition, and is the statement of the essential confession, that we confess the Trinity, we confess the Incarnation, and the resurrection, and the existence of the Church and of the resurrection. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. Can you hear her?
Yeah, just a little bit. It's not a big deal.
Okay.
Just a little background noise. Would be fine.
And we love creation, including the barking beasts, for goodness sake.
Yeah, I guess the beasts are God's children too.
They are, and they're part of our creation. And Adam when he's placed in the garden, the first thing he does is name them. So you had to ask your question again, because it's a serious answer to say, as a Christian, I affirm what the Church affirms, and that we as a community, in the tradition, recognize the doctrine that was revealed through the incarnation of Christ. And any other sort of flavor of Christianity that you're trying to talk about is kind of nonsensical if it doesn't begin with the creed.
Well, I was just kind of trying to get a more general idea, because like a lot of people, myself included, they might consider themselves in some sense Christian, but that doesn't fully encapsulate their beliefs. And I personally have interests and ideas that kind of expand beyond the bounds of traditional Christianity. Like, I am, in some sense, I consider myself a Hermeticist. Have you ever read the Hermetic Corpus?
Some of it, yes, a long time ago.
Okay, that to me is rather fascinating, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that in a moment. But
Okay.
Oh yeah. No, go ahead. What have you?
So I mean, you're making me think. It's saying I believe in things outside of Christianity. How? Right? And there's a no. There's a theological claim there, which is, um, the statement of the faith is a statement of reality, right? I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, or in the Nicene Creed, it's creator of heaven and earth. One way or the other, you're affirming that our reality is in fact a creature, and that we inhabit it as creatures of God. So, and I'm afraid my dog is trapped, and that's why she's barking all there.
If
She's managed to trap herself in some context in which it's silly. She can get out of it, but she just isn't. Um, I suppose that could be a metaphor for our existence. And so anything that you say about the creation is contained within that claim, right? That we are creatures made in the image, in the image and likeness of God. It's obviously from Genesis, but that we as human beings, what we know, what we can know, any knowledge that we have is in some way either given to us by God, or um, accessible to us through faculties that we were created with by
oh,
God, right? So
wait,
so the claim of there being anything outside of Christianity in those terms is nonsense, right? And so, and I can push you on that.
yeah, please. Let me just stop you there first of all. And when you say God or human beings are made in the likeness of God, what exactly do you think that means? Because there is an understanding of that from the Hermetic corpus, which I'm actually quite fond of, in that God is mind. And this is kind of hearkening to the notion of pantheism, in that like
Hmm.
God pervades everything and God is like the substance of reality, but God exists kind of as a conscious, all-pervasive force. And the traditional Christian understanding seems to have been, or from mainstream sources, is that man is made in God's image as somehow physically similar to human beings.
Okay, so that helps me to understand what you're asking. Obviously, understanding what that image and likeness is a great. It's the great question of Christian anthropology, as it were, the great question of who are we as creatures. What is the image in which we're made? Now, what you're describing um, from the Hermetic position is more like, um, God is a mind, and it's the creation isn't really his creation, it's just his body, right? That there's the sort of incarnation of God
The
through physical reality,
Yeah,
physical existence.
the way I understand it is that all creation is God's creation, but the creation is actually God kind of realizing itself or bringing itself into being, or expanding its parameters of selfdom, I guess you could say, and exploring itself as it unravels itself into the reality that it itself is, I guess you could say.
Okay, so there's a number of problems with that. One, that means that we don't exist as persons.
Well, we
Um,
exist as like
we're certain
cells.
aspects of
Yeah,
God, right?
yeah.
We're particles of this God thing. In Christian terms, no, because there's, I mean, and that is, it's a challenging sort of recognition that, although we are made in the image and likeness of God, we are not God. Although in, um, you know, what one's goal is in life, as it were, is to be transformed, as Paul says, from glory to glory into that image and likeness. That there is this recognition, and I think there is this problem. Exactly, why aren't we the perfect image and likeness already? And that's the problem of the fall. Why is it that we don't seem to be able to behave or act or live according to this image that we carry in our creation? And to identify it as just our soul or just our mind, that is also one of the great theological questions. Augustine spent a long time in his work on the Trinity trying to sort of particularize what that image and likeness is. It's like, is it different faculties in the mind, so that you can say it's memory, reason, and will. I hope those are his three. But to say that, to say that the faculties that we have, that we're created with, are in some way reflections of the three persons of the Trinity. Can you see their interaction as in fact that reflection? Well, he found out, it's like it kind of works metaphorically, but not really. It's you end up with the recognition that no, that isn't what God is as Trinity, just to divide it out into these faculties. So you're already in trouble. To say that God is a mind is different from saying God is three persons. And that we can have a particular relationship with them. The Hermetic understanding doesn't seem to me, the way you've described it, to suggest that we can have any relationship with God, because we don't really exist independently of God in that formulation. We are further aspects of the divine's self-emanation.
My understanding of Hermeticism has kind of been hybridized with my own understanding of like metaphysics, because I'm just kind of a conceptual collagist, if you will. I like to
I'm trying to correct that for you.
Yeah, I suppose it's a correction from your point of view. Maybe from my point of view, it's just another perspective or another set of ideas that can be applied to the same consideration.
Okay, and this is why talking religion is controversial, right? And that ultimately what one needs to do, and I think this is something I'm practicing, in the sense that I'm trying as a Christian to get better at explaining the core claims of this particular theology, that you end up rubbing up against people's convictions, right? And I wonder, saying, what conviction do you live by if you think of the world as this emanation, and as God simply as this world mind that do you have access to it? Are you part of it? How do you behave as a do you think of yourself as having a soul? I mean, all of these things, to recognize that there are, if you define God in that way, it sort of ramifies out into full descriptions of who you are as a
for
human being.
sure. Can we start to unravel that maybe piece by piece, because there are too many things for me to address there with the whole list of challenges you've just posed to me. So I guess
I'm glad you recognize that I just did.
Well, it would be difficult to not notice that because I'm paying attention. But anyway,
I don't know. Not everybody does. Sometimes, you could retreat back into saying, no. I mean, this, okay. So just to frame this a little bit, this is the problem of the conversation of the history, religious studies, right? I prompted you to say I'm actually in history rather than medieval studies. Medieval studies has its own problems of definition and disciplinarity, but religious studies is chronically incapable of defining what it talks about. And much of it comes from the invention of this idea in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that all religions teach the same things. And so the large exercise in modernity, particularly the 20th century, and particularly in whatever we call religious studies, has been to find the similarities, and basically it's like finding the lowest common denominators of claims, right? And then say that's what's real. The middle ground, I think it's a lowest common denominator fallacy, because what you end up with is this sort of mishmash of, well, we're kind of spiritual beings.
Yeah, that's kind of like the middle ground fallacy as well. It's like everybody compromises till you find yourself in a very kind of vague middle that's not really well defined.
Right. And so my project right now, if you will, although I understand project itself is a problematic term in the sense of it's a kind of Marxist way of thinking, but anyway,
we're just playing with language anyway.
So my purpose, my that's more Aristotelian. Anyway, what I'm trying to figure out now is saying, okay, the Christian tradition defined itself according to that creed, right? And all of the claims in that creed matter, beginning with this claim of God the Father Almighty is maker of heaven and earth. And just we could spend the entire time talking about that phrase,
I
right?
I'd love to kind of get a clearer definition of what you mean when you use the word God, and if you want me to elaborate my beliefs of what I understand the parameters of my conceptions of God to be, then we can get into that too. But if you
Okay.
would kind of elaborate a little more on when you say God, what exactly do you mean? Let's just pretend you were talking to an alien. I mean, I might look like one, but I'm actually from planet Earth. But if I were an alien, how would you explain the notion of God to me if I'd never heard it before?
Okay, I just did. Maker of heaven and earth, right? And
Okay.
I mean, this is a problem in Christian theology because in the later Middle Ages, there's this scholastic theological tradition called nominalism that worried about these things like names, right? Like they're nominalists, right? That they're meditating on the question of the name, the word, nouns, right? And one of the things they are struggling with is what do you do with that word God, right? What in fact does it define? And what Occam came up with, he's the great nominalist, right?
Yeah, Occam's
He of
razor.
Occam's razor, right? This sort of don't multiply explanations,
Hypotheses need not be
hypotheses.
multiplied without necessity.
Real well done. So he comes up with this problem. It's like, well, God is being, right? So if you define God as being, that's where you would then end up with the problem in modernity of sort of looking for places in which God exists, right? That existence is being a being question. So when you ask, does God exist? You're asking, does God have a sort of beingness that is like our being, right? Which ultimately, leads, as many have argued, leads to the conclusion that if you can explain everything, as it were, without invoking that being, God of the gaps, right? Which is a kind of caricature anyway of the problem. But that if we as scientists can explain, the mechanisms of this physical reality that we find ourselves in without invoking creator, the existence of God as creator, then we don't need God, and it's clearly just a fiction that people have come up with
Yeah,
to satisfy themselves that who knows what, right?
that was dubbed the problem of the telos by 19th century biologists who were just trying to separate themselves from religion and I think take power away from the religious institutions at the same time and kind of seize it for themselves.
Yes, much of this is turf wars intellectually.
Yeah,
Often,
it was their will to power to bring
it was
everything
their
into
turf wars. Their turf wars over human status and institutions and things like that. But
yeah,
they create metaphysical problems in the process.
yeah, I
Um,
agree.
and the material world has no telos of itself, right? Unless you're positing that it was created in order to have a telos.
Okay.
And so they're different. They're different. In I guess in Aristotelian terms, they'd be different levels of causality, and that their final cause, their purpose, their meaning. They cannot have a purpose or meaning without there being a creator to have created them for some purpose, right? And I have a number of my answers to a lot of these questions. The best ones I found are with the Inklings, like Tolkien and Lewis and Dorothy Sayers as well. Tolkien has a little letter that he wrote in answer to a question that his publisher's daughter asked him about what was the purpose of life. And he says, well, that, to pose that question posits, some, not being, he doesn't make that mistake. It posits a creator to have given us purpose in the first place. Otherwise, it's just a meaningless question, right? We
Yeah.
have no purpose. There is utterly purposeless.
Really? You think so?
Yes. because who else are then we serving, right? What
Would you mind if I disagreed there for a moment? I think.
I'm happy for you to disagree. You're just
Oh,
wrong.
fantastic. Okay, yeah, you can think what you like. But I think there does seem to be a telos and a direction as even as science understands the reality we find ourselves in, is that it is an unfoldment that is essentially endlessly complexifying. And as far back as you look in history and even prehistory, it seems that the telos or aim is complexity building over time, and it's like a fractal that is deepening and deepening, and the deeper the fractal gets, the more complex it gets, and it goes on infinitely, and it just keeps building on previously established complexity. And this kind of ties in to Ilya Prigozhin. Have you ever heard of Ilya Prigozhin?
I haven't read him yet.
Yeah, well, I'm not like super well schooled on him, but I'm familiar enough with his Nobel Prize winning thesis, which was basically non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which was, it basically disproved the second law of thermodynamics, that over time systems tend to dissipate, and then you have the whole kind of scientific understanding of reality, that everything over time is just gonna run down to zero. And that was
Mm-hmm.
basically the extrapolation of the second law of thermodynamics and applying it to like a grand cosmic metaphysical scale. But Ilya Prigozhin showed scientifically that structures tend to build on previously established layers of complexity, and over time complexity grows, or complexity spontaneously erupts out of states of lower order.
Fine. What's its purpose?
To express complexity and find deeper and deeper levels of variety.
Why?
Because
Why?
it's infinity. I believe the parameters of God are
So
infinite,
how do you?
just like reality is infinite, and infinity playing itself out is just an endless complexification over time that is deepening further and further.
I think that's the theme of the second Guardians of the Galaxy movie recently, where the ego is infinitely trying to create
Well,
multiple
I'm sure
worlds.
they borrowed the idea from somewhere that wasn't actually the origin point.
Well, no, but I mean, if you play it out mythologically, then I think it starts helping you see how that it's like, so I could say, fine, God is infinitely creative in his delight in making the world more and more complex. It doesn't actually change the problem of saying whether there's a purpose. I don't. It's like,
I think the purpose is realizing the infinite complexity, which is the parameters, I suppose, of divinity.
but that means there's no purpose in that, right?
Yeah,
There's nothing you as a human being are
well,
called to become other than more complicated, right? And there's certainly
yeah,
no
exactly.
morality. There's no morality in that, and
It's like well, I think it's like a
there's no meaning.
distillation over time. I find meaning in it anywhere. I perceive meaning in
Why?
it.
Why do you find meaning in it?
Because as I grow older, I feel like as reality is trying to complexify as it ages, then I also should act in kind as a microcosm of the macrocosm, and I
That's
should be
definitely hermetic.
refining.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly. I should be refining and distilling myself over time, just as reality seems to be taking the same course of action. And I
What does that
find,
look like? What does complexifying look like?
well, it does not necessarily look like anything, because a lot of the complexity is internal. It is just understanding things with more and more detail, and more points of connection, and more hearkening to specifics, and understanding minutia, and just
Okay,
developing.
that's lovely, but what it sounds what from my perspective it sounds like you're describing is the delight in studying the creation.
That's another way of thinking of it. I don't disagree. That's a fine
Well,
way of
but
looking at it.
do you see, so what you're doing, you tend to be talking on a descriptive level, like this is what's happening, right? And then I ask you for meaning, and you say, well, basically what you just described there to my hearing is an exercise of contemplation, which is very enjoyable, right? I'm assuming you do this because you enjoy it.
I also see utility in it at the same time, but yeah, I
How
guess it's
so? How is
enjoyable.
contemplation useful?
Because if you refine your understanding, you are more logically together intellectually and more coherent in your understanding of ideas and understanding of things generally. And I just find that it's edifying overall to understand things on a deeper level than surface level understanding, which a lot of people seem to be stuck on, and people don't think deeply, and it causes them problems intellectually, and it leads to the state in the world and the culture where we have a developing culture of not deeply considering issues and being easily fooled by emotional understanding of issues and a will to be offended and a will to not consider things deeply enough to understand that other people think differently and that our point of view is not primary. You get what I mean? You know, the whole kind of...
And it's all, I mean, I agree with everything you say. I see what it is though differently than you do. That again, you're describing the delight of contemplation. I'd say, which is in Christian terms, we're drawn to, I mean, what Augustine talked about in non-Christian doctrine was the difference between things that we use and things that we enjoy. And our great delight is in God, right? Our great delight is in contemplation of the Creator. We have things that we use in the creation, but we don't direct ourselves to them, right? That's where you end up with sort of idolatry. You're and also that we should not use people, right? They are creatures like we are, who have free will and are made in the image and likeness of God. So it's evil to use them, right? But what you're describing is that the joy that we have in contemplating the creation, and you're saying, and I asked you what the purpose was and what the meaning was, and you said, well, because deeper understanding is I would say, as you were speaking, you asked me what's God, what image and likeness are we made in, and you're describing it there, right? You're describing that ability to contemplate and understand and reason and see the complexity. All of that I still categorize from within the sense of we are made in the image and likeness of God, not we are God.
I wouldn't necessarily say that we are God. I would maybe be more willing to take the position that we are a reflection of God, or we are a cell in the greater organism of God. To
Okay,
use
those are two different things.
well, yeah, I know there are metaphors, and all language is metaphoric anyway, and I consider myself to be a primate playing with concepts, so I'm not going to be able to get at objective truth.
Okay, that's good. That's good. And that's exactly what Dorothy Sayers says about the creed, right? So when I'm playing with you about saying, what do I believe in God? I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. That she makes this very good point that all language that we use to talk about God is metaphorical.
Well, all
Because
language is metaphorical
all
anyway.
language is metaphorical. And she has this wonderful thing saying, to say that she's worried about anthropomorphizing, right? And say if we speak of God using our own yardstick, that's ridiculous. We speak of everything using our own yardstick. We're always speaking from the position of ourselves
Yeah,
as human
exactly.
beings. So
Exactly.
that's
That's
fine.
very Nietzschean, actually. I'm a huge proponent of Friedrich Nietzsche's work. So that's it.
I gotta get you over to Christ here. So
Okay, well, I'm not atheistic like Nietzsche was, but I'm very fond of his ethics of joy and how well he
good.
developed a lot of concepts that are life affirming and very much positive as far as I'm concerned.
Well, but the thing is, I think that many people, what I'm basically trying to help you see and to talk through is many of the concepts that you default back into. I mean, you were talking about, so I worry that people who can't talk to each other and can't understand each other properly don't see each other as having their own interiors, and we don't seem to appreciate all of that. You're defaulting into a Christian anthropology,
How do you mean?
that you recognize other people as ensouled creatures, and that they have dignity, and that it's important for us, and this is where the Augustine came in, right? That it's important for us not to use each other as objects. That we are, always, when you're encountering another human being, you're encountering someone who is like you, made in the image and likeness of God. And that's basically the theological basis for all of our claims about human rights, right? Is that, and so that the sort of extension of human rights to things that aren't human is a big problem, because then you're sort of saying, well, like robots and dogs and things like that. But the theological claim is that we as creatures have a dignity, is the basis of most of our political reasoning at present, even though it ends up, it can apparently put people on opposite sides of the political spectrum. The claim is that we should not treat each other like objects.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I wouldn't disagree.
And without the claim that we are made as human beings in the image and likeness of God, there is no basis for not treating each other like objects. Otherwise, we're just equal. I'm not sure we can test it with your pantheism, but if I'm no different materially from a rock, there's no reason not to use me like a rock.
Oh, well, I wouldn't agree with the fact that if we what was your point before the point
Um,
with the rock?
so the problem of politics and human dignity is recognizing each other as um, fellows. I mean, fellow souls is not quite the right phrase, but not as objects, right? And
Yeah.
evil. I mean, evil. Almost everybody in Western civilization tends to agree that using other people as objects is evil,
That
right?
is definitely true, but I I agree with you on that point of view, and I hope everybody would, or at least most people. But I don't necessarily see how it is appropriate, or yeah, I don't necessarily see how you need to recognize another person as a soul to be able to understand that you are similar to them on so many levels and are capable of suffering, and they are capable of suffering too, and they are capable of being hurt just like you as an individual are. I understand that religion has these grand unifying themes where everyone is kind of on the same page as understanding a
Well,
lot of things.
that we even care about that is a Christian problem, right? They certainly didn't care about it in antiquity before Christianity. They were perfectly willing to see slaves as not fully human. They were perfectly willing to see outsiders, barbarians, as not fully human. I mean, the Christians claimed everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. It's the greatest social revolution ever.
Yeah, I guess I just think on that point, I don't think it's a necessity for religion to have empathy with other people, but at the same time, I do see how it does make it kind of a part of just the accepted, understood culture and ideology that people share, that you need to love your neighbor and treat people generally well. Um,
Well, we think that in the Western Christian culture, but that's not the default. That's not the default belief, right? For example, I mean, of any of and this is, so you're going to, my great heroes in terms of articulating these things clearly are people like Sayers. I said Chesterton is also really good at it. He says, we have this. It's hard because we're fish swimming in water, right? And what I'm trying to convince you of, which is tricky, is the water exists and it's Christianity. And you are seeing and it's like, how to, what else, what I can't think of outside the water. That's one of my difficulties. I have a hard time. Anyway, Chesterton has this argument where he's talking about all of these things that say in the early 20th century, people are saying, they'd rather have, and paganism or Celtic religiosity, or, I mean, many of the social movements that seem to think they can dispense with Christianity. And there's a current movement. I've seen articles recently about, we'd be better off if we were just like the ancient pagans, right? Marcus Aurelius was a good guy. Why can't we be like him? And Chesterton is saying, in fact, what you don't realize is, one, how cold ancient paganism was, right? There's no place for love, right? The great Christian claim is God is love, that we exist in love, is specifically a Christian claim. It doesn't come from any other tradition. It's not the way Hindus have bhakti devotion, which is actually quite important. It's a love devotion, but Buddhism doesn't worry about love, right? It worries about compassion for the suffering of other creatures, but it doesn't say we exist in a creation that was, a work of love on the part of our Creator. And the other thing, and I'm not sure I got this from Chesterton, is paganism was really cruel, right? If you go for paganism, what you tend to the end point of paganism is human sacrifice.
Can you actually elaborate on paganism a little bit? Because I think that's an interesting point of view that a lot of people won't have a coherent understanding of what you mean by paganism.
So paganism in the sort of etymology of it, it just means it was the rustics, right? Because Christianity is an urban religion. It begins in Jerusalem, and it has very urban sort of sociological roots that, it's spread from city to city. If you think about the ways in which the stories are told, it's in a very citied world. The ancient world, we think of modernity as the great urban moment, but the ancient world was filled with cities, and the early Christian, the apostles and the early Christian witnesses to Jesus, went from city to city and set up churches and communities and things like that. In antiquity, what the cities would have their own gods, right? They'd each have their own, like Athena is the goddess of Athens. Rome had it has its pantheon, right, of gods, but they have a Roma, the city god. And ancient paganism was truly a I'm losing my words.
Was it like a collection of different deities?
Yes,
Or?
yes. What you play off of is that sort of claim of, your God versus my God, right? It's boss fights between all the gods. And so if you go to and the Romans recognized that, right? When they conquered people, they take their gods.
Yeah, that's actually similar in Hinduism as well. That's why they
Okay.
have such an elaborate collection of deities. There are like thousands of different deities because they've absorbed all these different religions from all the surrounding regions.
Right. So you have that sense of, that it really does. I mean, it's the tribalism that we're all worrying about right now, that and in Christian terms, you've made an idol of a limited good of the city and its existence. But you've also, defined yourself according to your worship of that particular city god. The other thing about the pagan gods, so they're local and they can aggregate, obviously, but that's sort of conquered people. They're like empires of gods, right? The other thing is that particularly in ancient Roman worship, the gods are cruel, right? And you expect them to be cruel, and that's why you make sacrifices to them. They're capricious. There are, what's clear in the descriptions that we have of Roman sacrifices, they're very, very concerned about making sure all the words are exactly right? Because you want to make sure that and the animals have to be pure and sacrificed in the appropriate way. And if anything goes wrong in the sacrifice, you're doomed.
Yeah, the
right?
Romans were sticklers for order.
Yes,
You can see it in their architecture.
So Christianity bursts into this world, right, and says God loves you. I mean, that's like mind blowing. It's like Zeus doesn't love me, right? that Jupiter loves me. That's ridiculous, right? So God loves you. All human
Eros
beings.
or Aphrodite love you.
No, but they don't either. They take cruel. Their sacrifices are cruel. Their service is cruel, and here comes along, people saying, you know, God has come among us and suffered with us and taken on our infirmity and our weaknesses to love, because He loves us so much that He wants to rescue us from our own disobedience to Him. Right. I mean, it's like how do you wrap your head around that as a pagan, right? Their version of it is, the gods punish us. That's appropriate because, we didn't do their sacrifices correctly, but they don't have love relationships with their
Yeah,
deity.
I think the Christian God is like the archetype of the good father.
Well, that Jung has that archetypal language. Again, he's Christian too. He's just fudging it,
He's a
right?
fairly staunch Catholic, but at the same time, he liked to have a lot of wild ideas that he
I think he,
elaborated off
yes,
into
yes.
crazy lands.
So that's one version of paganism. Think about it in antiquity and think what Christianity was and the answer to it. And that Chesterton shows that. Another way of thinking about it is when the Christians in the 16th century and their expansion into the rest of the world came into contact with other pagans. And actually, this works too if you're talking about the Germanic religions. But let me give this other example. So the Spanish, when they encounter the Aztecs, what we know in the present is ultimately the Spanish conquer. And because we're Christian and we don't like people being oppressed, that is a difficult story for Christians to hear, because we say, well, but shouldn't they just let them live on their own? Well, but they were eating people, right? And one of the most interesting arguments in their defense was written by Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Dominican, and was there in the mission field in the 16th century, and wrote a fairly famous letter to Charles V and his son Philip II, saying, in defense of the Indians, you've got to no, that was his short history of the Indies. You've got to stop killing these people. That's not the way to convert them. But in his longer work in the defense of the Indians, he says, well, look, they're human like us. They're rational like us. They have civilization like us. I mean, he's undoing the whole sort of noble, not the noble savage, but the savages image, right, that the Europeans were using. It's like saying, no, he'd been living with them for a time, and he's saying they're rational. They're creatures of God, just like us. But they lack revelation. They lack the understanding of God that we have of as loving and creator. And so they rationalize themselves into making the best sacrifices that they possibly can, which is human beings, right? So, it's very, Las Casas' argument is very interesting, saying basically human sacrifice is the best you do if all you have is reason. And you could say that we're really good at that in modernity, right? It's like we've undone the sense that God sacrificed himself for us, so we are now saved to become what we were made to be, and replaced it with human sacrifice, which is kill for the sake of the republic. I mean, the French were great at that in the Terror, and the Soviet Union was brilliant at that. The Maoists were brilliant at that. They weren't coming from a Christian context, but the Soviet Union as communists were brilliant at that, and certainly Hitler was great at that. What you get if you take away Christianity is human sacrifice.
Oh, that's a fairly interesting point. I've always wondered, was it just that the people who did not adhere to Christian morality, that they had people that they wanted to kill, so they just made up some story about needing to make human sacrifices to appease the gods, so they could just like point out all the people they wanted dead and sacrifice them for the protection of the rest of the tribe or community.
Sure, but you've just made a perfect Christian argument, right? There is no argument outside of Christianity that doesn't say don't do that, right? And that's one of the arguments that I have specifically with Steven Pinker's argument in Better Angels of Our Nature, where he's trying to claim, I mean, I do think in fact he's right that there has been a decline of violence over some parts of modernity, and he has a wonderful description of how brutal and cruel the ancient world is. But he places the change, the agent of change, in the wrong millennium. But also it gives it, he says it's the Enlightenment, right, which is like hundreds of years too late. There were already criticisms of that kind of kill your neighbor for your own purpose in the Middle Ages, because it's Christian, right? It's a Christian argument to worry about whether or not it's appropriate to fight.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm getting better at this. I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah, I think we like jumped in at the deep end and kind of like got really bogged down in deep theological matters, like right from the get-go. So maybe we can pull back a little from here, and I can ask you about atheism. And obviously, over the past few generations, even more, there has been a rise in atheism, especially in the West, and this is clearly leading to some moral quandaries, or people are just losing coherent moral systems that they can share amongst each other, and it's kind of become more and more an every man for himself sort of free for all. And I was wondering how you as a Christian would even begin to argue with or try to convince an atheist that they are maybe misled or mistaken about the state of reality and the
Because I
reality of
think they
God.
are. So I talked about the religious studies problem, right? That sort of all religions teach the same thing. That is one of the great sort of lies of the of modernity.
Oh, that's utter naivete as far as I'm concerned. I
Yes,
very
good.
clearly don't.
That's like saying, everybody has politics, so all political systems are the same. No,
Yeah.
they're not, right?
Everybody wears clothes, so clothes are the same, so I can walk around in a dress and no one will have a problem with that.
It depends on the dress. So right. So that we don't, but that's often one of the atheist arguments. I heard it. I was re-listening to the Drunken Peasants have their little conversation with Milo, and one of them, as an atheist, kept bringing up this. Well, you believe in your fairy god, your sky fairy. How is that different from these other people whom you're criticizing for having ridiculous religious beliefs, like, I don't know, Scientologists, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And there's fallacy there, saying, well, because this worship, this system of worship is false or idolatrous, that means all there's no such thing as true religion, right? That's completely fallacious,
Yeah,
right?
that's a weak argument.
Good. Okay, so we've dispensed with that one. So I think, having thought about it in those terms, I think, one, I don't think there's such a thing as atheism. I
Can
think
you
I
expand on that before we continue?
yes, because I think, I mean, so as a Christian, I would say, we are made to worship, right? And going back to Tolkien, what he says is, once you understand that we're made in the image and likeness of a creator, our purpose in life is to praise God. It's Thanksgiving tomorrow in the United States, and so
Hey, happy
give thanks,
Thanksgiving.
right? To give thanks for our existence, to praise God for the beauty and wonder of His creation. That's our purpose, right? And if you think about that, that's ultimately, in fact, what Christian worship is. It's you go into a place where you raise your voices up and cry, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty! Heaven and earth are full of Your glory." It's thank you, right? It's it's saying our existence is a gift, and we are surrounded by beauty and love. And obviously there's evil in the world, and people would say, oh, for example, Jordan Peterson has been saying, no, our prime reality is suffering. It's like, no, your prime reality is suffering if you don't recognize that your purpose is to praise God.
Did he make the point that it was our primary reality, or that it was an important aspect of reality not to be denied? Because I thought it was the latter, and if it's the former, then
when he's in his discussion with Sam Harris, which is the most recent one I talked, that they're sort of trying to find ground, right, that they agree on.
Mm-hmm.
And Harris is an atheist, and who knows what Jordan is. And that's the first place they start, right? So it's suffering is your it seemed to me he was saying it's our prime reality, right? The sort of, you start from suffering.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
I'll look into that a little more.
okay.
You know, we want to be clear about the sort of claims he's making or interpretations
Fair
thereof.
enough. Fair enough. Okay. So that's what I heard him say
Hmm.
in the discussion with Sam Harris. I mean, that they're trying to start with suffering. And I say, well, that, suffering is a reality if you're not recognizing that we are given this gift of life, and
Hmm.
it's something to be thankful for. That atheists typically tend to be taking something other than God, our maker, as their focus of attention, right? And in Christian terms, they're making idols of them. That an idol is the thing that you hang your your meaning on, right? You hang your meaning on. So atheists tend to make idols of reason, right? They
Okay.
tend, and certainly since the Enlightenment, that's been a respectable philosophical position, to say, that which we can know rationally or empirically, that's true, right? And everything else is fantasy and made up. Well, then you've in fact taken one aspect of our creatureliness, one aspect of our I'm trying to avoid the word existence because it has the nominalist sort of problem of what are you talking about when you're talking about being, but that you've taken one aspect of reality and the goodness that we've been given by our creator and focused everything on that, right? And so you've made an idol of that. Well, what happens when you worship idols? I think you know the answer to that based on our previous discussion.
Human sacrifice.
Human sacrifice.
Uh-oh.
Right? It's literally what happened in the French Revolution. That they set up this cult of reason, and then Robespierre came along and tried to make it the cult of the supreme being or whatever, and human sacrifice, right? And so I mean, it's an interesting thing that what if an idol is what you end up sacrificing other human beings to. That's it's exactly the things that, say, Jordan says he's so upset about with, those bloody leftists. The problem I see from my perspective is they've made idols of things like the state. Certainly fascism is trying to give in Mussolini and his co-authors account of the fascist faith. They make the state the sort of ground of the individual's self-realization, right? That you
Yeah.
are who you are through this. Well, they've made an idol of the state. Obviously not good.
If I could maybe hijack your point of view there for a second, you were
Sure.
saying that life is about creation and gratitude and love and I guess the being thankful for the amazing reality that we find ourselves in, and that atheists don't feel that and they don't express that, and they are looking for idols elsewhere. And I would think maybe it's because these people have unhappy lives and they don't have a whole lot to kind of attach their sense of self to, and they just see religion as another nefarious institution, and so they kind of are binding themselves to what is more culturally relevant, which is science, and that they are
Mm-hmm.
basically just going with the flow because science is kind of the leading theological system of contemporary times, and
Mm-hmm.
that is, the popular choice, and that is what is most widely accepted, and so they just kind of default into thinking that science is the new deity and that God is dead, as Nietzsche put it.
Well said. You realize and that is very well said. What they've done is they're worshiping the world, right? And let me unpack that for you. That I've meditated a lot on this, so we can go political if you want,
Mhm.
because it's terrifying to have society turn against you. There is, I think, I mean, and you could say, I mean, it's why civilization functions at all. People don't like other people disliking them, and I mean, we call them sociopaths and various other kinds of things when they're saying that people are unaffected by what other people think about them. Most people are terribly, horribly affected by what other people think about them, which makes it very hard once a group starts thinking something, right? So when you're talking about, atheists, I'd say so-called atheists, right? But atheists are focusing on science, and that's the institution that there's a social function there, right? You get infinitely more approval in modern society if you can talk about yourself as a scientist, right? We have made an idol of that ability to describe the physical world accurately. It's an aspect of what, and when you were talking earlier about, what you like studying, you were describing to me contemplation, right? Which I think has a holiness to it because you are understanding it as something to be enjoyed, I said, and its complexity is graspable by the human mind, so it's delight to study. I mean, those are theological claims too. You're making a claim that you want to understand, you want to use your human mind to understand this creation, so you say it's understandable, right? That's already a kind of claim. I mean, not necessarily all religions claim that it's understandable in those terms. That's a very Christian claim, that there is a rationality to the creation that we can contemplate and enjoy. So it's not that science as itself is bad, not at all. It's making an idol of it, making it the thing that you invest your meaning in, and the atheistic focus on, most scientists aren't atheists anyway, but although some prominent ones are, when you focus yourself on that institution, when you're focusing on the approbation of society, and what this will be the theme. You can call this why without Christianity we end up with human sacrifice. Human science, the atheist scientific arguments are very fine with human sacrifice. I mean, you go from abortion, which is a practice of human sacrifice on the altar of self-choice, which is
or liberalism, or just
or
the will to do whatever the hell you want.
Right. Any of these death cults, right? The euthanasia stuff is clearly are wanting to be in control of life and death. Human sacrifice.
On the point of death cults, can I get your appraisal of Islam?
It's most. The thing is, most Islam has the wrong focus, right? And I'd say there's a theological problem at the heart of all of this that nobody will ever talk about. And they're always talking about the sort of social effects to point to the problem. The problem is it denies the incarnation.
Really, do you not think like that a lot of the whole Islamic system is about how to attain control and how to coerce and how to wage war? I mean, those are deeply knit into the... I even kind of shudder at the thought of using the word theology when speaking about Islam, because it's more of a political system or a doctrine of conquest than it is a theology.
It has a theology, just like atheists have a theology. But you asked me what it means to be a Christian. I started with the creed. The creed claims, 1, maker of heaven and earth. We are creatures in a creation. 2, incarnation, right? And that God entered into his creation in order to remake it. He's a maker, he's remaking it by way of his incarnation, and that he became a human being fully, suffered fully. I mean, and in fact was literally rejected by the world, right? He's killed by the mob. And if you can tell the story in a lot of different ways. Pilate is the authority who should have been in charge and just washes his hands of it. That it's corrupt institutions that are more worried about. I mean, the leaders of the Jews in first century Palestine as a Roman province were not in a happy place, right? Herod as king is a complicated sort of relationship with the Romans. Obviously, the Jewish authorities had gotten concessions from the Romans in terms of being able to maintain their own worship, whereas the Romans tended to like wipe out other people's gods. We've talked about that. So it's not easy, right, to be Annas and Caiaphas. But I mean, what ultimately happens, the way the story is told in the Gospels, is Pilate was afraid of the mob, right? He's afraid of all of the people shouting, "Crucify Jesus." And I was thinking about this in last spring, in the sense of what happens when the mob goes for the individual. Jesus is basically lynched by the state, but under the pressure of the mob, right? To say that God willed himself into that situation for Islam is utter blasphemy, right? I mean, that's why it really is truly utter blasphemy. You cannot conceive of God humiliating himself in that way, emptying himself to become part of his own creation. But Christianity, you know, as a Christian, that is why we're saved, right? Otherwise, it's there's not that relationship of love.
It's the utter gesture of humility, you know, the self-sacrifice, whereas Muhammad was like the prophet of manly virtues, and he was like the alpha as far as the Judeo-Christian theological framework goes, and I'm including Islam in that. Is Islam technically a part of the Judeo-Christian religions?
No, no.
Monotheistic religions.
No. Those terms are all confusing and do not get the theology right.
Okay.
As far as Jews were concerned in antiquity, the Christians were the polytheists. So again,
is there a term that is like broadly encompassing that includes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Because I was just under the impression like Judeo-Christian religions or monotheistic religions generally included Islam in the category, but that's maybe a misnomer on my part. You would know better, obviously.
I say no. Because it goes back to the claim of all religions teach the same thing, right? And what we've been trying to establish is how, in fact, the theological differences matter.
For sure. But is there a term you can use that encompasses all of the three, or even including Buddhism as well, all the major religions of the past 2,000 years?
No. And this, go back to the religious studies problem. Religion, properly speaking, means worship, right? And so there is this question of what is the true religion. Now, it is Christians are uncomfortable, we've established, with killing other people, and therefore have tried very hard.
Not all of them.
Well, they need to well, it's tricky, right? Because sometimes, Augustine does come up with reasons out of Roman legal understanding, but also out of his meditation on theology. Christians are allowed to defend ourselves, right? That's there is a justness and I mean, Jesus, if the Christians who always say, is it in the gospel? Yes. I mean, that Peter takes up a sword when Jesus is arrested, and they ask, do you have any swords? And they say, we have 2. And he says, that's enough. It's like, it's appropriate for Christians to fight when attacked, right? That's not the question. But the problem is, and this is the theological problem that we need to continue to practice wrestling with, there is one true religion. There is one true understanding of the proper worship that we give to our Creator as creatures.
Why do you say there is only one? Like, do you have an exact angle on that, other than Christianity is obviously the right answer, as you seem to be of the position?
That's what I tried. You asked me to make the argument, right?
Okay, but
and the argument, right?
Like, do you have an evidence or reason-based argument as to why exactly that is, that you could elaborate for the audience?
Joy. Christianity is the religion of joy. Okay. And we are made to be creatures that God made us because he loves us, and he wants us to enjoy him, right? Joy is the argument. No other religion focuses on joy in the way that Christianity does. but it's Christianity that gave us this problem of seeing all other religions as other religions, right? Other modes of worship. Remember when I told you about Las Casas and his argument about human sacrifice as being rational? It's in fact out of that the early 20th century efforts to figure out which were the good bits in the other modes of describing our existence were actually also true. And Las Casas is, I mean, it's a Christian impulse to say, look, we were all made in the image and likeness of God. That means we all carry with us some part of our making. No, there's nothing that exists that's utterly corrupt, right? Because evil, that sort of evil is falling away from the goodness that we were made in. So if it exists at all, there's some good still left in it, right? So you're trying to find what's good there. And Las Casas, for goodness sake, bless his heart, goes to, the Aztecs and says, well, okay, you're killing people by flinging them on their backs, cutting their hearts out with a stone knife and chopping them up and flinging your limbs down into the beasts that eat them at the bottom of the temple, and then sprinkling blood all over your idols to feed them. But there's good in that. Right. So it's curious that we have such a thing as, quote, religious studies at all is itself under a Christian umbrella. Now, ask my colleagues at the Divinity School that, and they will tell you that I am not diverse enough with the diversity. And they've written letters about that and put them on the internet and say, no, you can't say that. And I say, you are still arguing within a Christian framework. That you are even wanting to have this argument in the first place is because you are starting from a Christian understanding of ourselves. And it's like I said, the fish and water problem it's always there if you're arguing in these terms, right? The sort of, are there other true faiths? No, there are distortions of the one truth that we actually inhabit.
On the point of faith,
your listeners are going crazy now.
Oh yeah, well, they will be in the future. This isn't live stream, so that's
Good.
just the projection of reactions of future listeners. But anyway, on the point of faith, do you believe that belief on God is entirely oriented in faith, or do you think that there are any pointers to, or even evidence of God's being, or the presence of God in our reality? Do you think there is evidence of God? Because I do.
I'm happy to hear it.
Okay.
So the evidence of God problem goes back to the nominalist question of whether God exists as a kind of being, and so we're looking for evidence. The evidence is all around us. We're here, right? And so the problem is whether or not you are. I mean, this is where I think faith, or the light, right? People talk about faith being blind. That's exactly opposite, right? Faith is the thing that enables you to see the reality that we're inhabiting. And those people are miserable who don't have faith, are miserable because they're cut off from seeing the beauty of our existence.
Yeah, I was just going to get into sacred geometry and maybe even fractal mathematics as evidence of God, because there is structure inherent in reality that was not constructed by human beings, that is infinitely complex and highly refined, and exists across nature on different scales, and it is so beautiful to behold, and it is so meaningful, and it's expressed in plants, in organs, in trees, in atomic systems. Just the coherence that is, if you draw up, like I'm wearing a little pendant right now that is the seed of life. I don't know if you know the seed of life, but it is sacred geometry that is both fractal and geometric, but it was discovered in nature that there are these patterns, like how plants grow. It's like there are certain formations they take and they branch out, and like certain plants have like repeating patterns and certain equations. If you map them on a visual plane, it will create fractal geometry similar to that found in nature. And that is completely removed from the human enterprise, and just the complexity and the detail and the level of beauty, to me, is evidence of structure outside of the human building blocks, but structure that repeats across scale. So it's like put in different places. It's not just unique in one place. It exists across. It's like a pattern or a blueprint that has been reused over and over again in the immanentization of creation, I guess.
So God made the world with what's the phrase that you look for it is because you're Christian. In the sense that Christianity is also, I mean, it's another of the sort of great lies of modernity is that science and religion are at odds with each other. No, the scientific mindset which you are describing, which is to look for the patterns, to look for the beauty, to look for the regularity, comes out of Christianity, because that's coming out of the understanding that we are creatures made in the image and likeness of Creator, who gave us the patterns by which we make. And that's one of the things that Dorothy Sayers talks about. So she says it's all metaphorical, right? But the great metaphor that we're starting with is we are made in the image and likeness of a Creator. We're artists, right? We are made to make things. And if, you know, two things that people seem to do, well, no, two things. The primary thing that people do is make stuff, right? We are the great makers.
Yeah.
Think a city,
That
right? Think
reminds
everything.
me of just a little line from the Hermetic Corpus that I'm not sure you're going to like, but that man is the brother of God, that we
Oh,
are
phooey.
co-creators in reality,
No,
basically.
no, 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 no. But it has an
Isn't
aspect
that what you were
of,
saying?
no, but it has an aspect of that delight in making, right? So we both study and contemplate, and we make stuff, right? Hands, great with your hands, right? But that we are made to be makers and artists, and that the modern scientific tradition that we were talking about, that, for example, atheists often point to as the great proof of their independence of God, comes out of the desire to contemplate in the terms that you're describing, particularly from the 13th century. And a lot of the work I've done on devotion to the Virgin Mary is also pointing to this, that they understand her in the Middle Ages appropriately as the one through whom the Creator showed himself to the world, right? The incarnation again. And in order to meditate on that and praise her as the mother of the Creator, Theotokos, mother of God, they say, well, you know, how do you describe she who contained the one who made the heavens and earth, right? He whom the heavens could not contain dwelt in her womb. Well, they do it by way of encyclopedic lists of titles of all of the creatures of creation, right? Which is also the way that you order your understanding into saying the celestial, the terrestrial, the botanical, the zoological, the mineral, the artistic, all show forth pattern, and that's all because they're made by a Creator. So what you're describing as your delight, again, I refer back to me, that's proof of our creatureliness.
Yeah, I mean, even mathematicians who are, you know, about as staunch and irreligious as you can get, you know, in their calculations and hypothesizing, generally even referred to the Mandelbrot set, if you know the Mandelbrot set,
Mm-hmm.
as the thumbprint of God, just because it is infinite complexity, which gets more and more complex. That the deeper you look at it, you know, you look at the
Right.
set and you zoom in, and within it, you know, you have like mini. That's, you know, another kind of, I don't know, I would consider it maybe a piece of evidence that like we are maybe like little gods or little parts within God that like reflect the image of God, is that in the Mandelbrot set, which is kind of an expression of reality, that there are little Mandelbrot sets, you know, within the greater or within the whole image, there are little recapitulations of the same structure.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
So I would say it's interesting. You take the existence of that beautiful pattern as evidence. I take your delight in it as evidence, right? That you respond with joy to that pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I see appreciation of complexity and appreciation of understanding, and the joy in response to that as divinity. It's like life pouring out of me. It's a vitality, and I see vitality as, you know, the essence of life, or Christos. Even isn't Christos supposed to be like the Christ energy? But it's also like that is what life is. The Christos is just the being.
Yeah, that's that
Yeah.
it's interesting how, you know, there's such magnificent theology in the Christian tradition that nobody knows, and so they get caught up in sort of I mean, obviously we our souls yearn for God, right? I think you and I, we've been talking for however long now, but our souls yearn for God, and um we yearn so much for it that we'll come up with other ways of describing it that don't point to God, right? And the Christos is, it means the anointed one. The Christ is the anointed one. He's the one that
I have
is
heard other understandings of it being like the Holy Spirit.
uh no. Do we have to do the Trinity too? I think we need to have a second
Yeah,
discussion.
I know. I
Um,
think we can get into the Trinity if we have
I,
time. How long have we been going? Actually,
I don't know. I
I
can't
have
see a
no,
clock.
yeah, I have no clock near me either.
We may we've I think we've gone through some deep topics, so maybe we should come back to it at another time. But
Yeah, no
um
problem.
so the it means anointed. That's just the Greek term. It means anointed, and the anointing is a marking as well. It's you're when you're baptized, you're anointed in that way, right? The chrism. So we're all Christs in those terms because we've been anointed into. It's a Christians are little Christs, right? We're anointed into that reality with God.
I like the little Mandelbrats and the Mandelbrats.
The little Mandelbrats. We're like the uh but no, I was trying to think about what I say about your delight, your joy, right? That okay, for example, Buddhism, right? There's no delight in that, right? The whole point is to evaporate, right?
Yeah, it's
You know,
complete self-negation.
right, that the you know the Four Noble Truths, the first of which is, you know, suffering, right? And your goal properly in Buddhism is to extinguish yourself,
Yeah, it's
right?
like non-being.
Non-being. That is not the claim that Christianity makes. The claim that Christianity makes is we are made for joy, right? We are made to delight and rejoice in God. And I'd say one of the big projects that I'm working on thinking how to talk about right now is virtue and what that means. And I think what I'm starting to understand is why Mary is the model of virtue, right? It's like, virtue is the Mary's the most virtuous because she responds to God perfectly, right? Her response to God and thinking about, I was just reading this morning about her Magnificat, right? That, you know, the first thing she says after Elizabeth says to her, "You're blessed among women," is, "My soul magnifies the Lord," right? She exclaims in joy to God, right? That is how you become virtuous. And what's interesting is once you're directed towards God properly in joy, all of the other virtues follow, right? Because you are directed properly towards your maker. I don't have the words yet to practice that, articulating it perfectly, but I'd say Christianity is the religion of joy, and joy is, if you want proof, it's your delight in that contemplation that shows you that you are made to do that.
Yeah, it's funny how many parallels there are between Nietzsche and Christianity. I mean, Nietzsche was heavily influenced by Christianity. His father was a deacon or something, and he was like brought up in a very religious family. So a lot of his philosophy is repeating a lot of themes from Christianity. But then, of course, there is also like the anti-Christian points of view, which I kind of just see as just I don't know, daddy issues, maybe, if you want to put it in such crude terms. But, I
That's
can
why the
see.
Trinity is such an important mystery, right? The proper relationship between the Father and the Son.
Yeah, I mean, that's vitally important generally. I mean, throughout human history and even today, I mean, a lot of the problems of modern day society is that people, or men especially, are often lacking a strong male role model, or the strong male role model is like at work all the time and doesn't have time to raise the children. So there is like a lack of a real positive male influence. And then you have like people just expressing their insecurities and their uncertainty of the parameters of masculinism through being overly macho or overly sexualized, or just they express their insecurities and lack of understanding about how it is to be a man in a number of different ways that are, I guess you could call toxic, toxic
Well,
masculinity.
women do it too.
Oh yeah, I don't
There's
disagree
toxic
on that point.
femininity out there as well.
For
But
sure, I agree very strongly with that. But just on the particular point that I was trying to get at there,
yes,
I,
with the
I definitely
Nietzsche, and
believe in
I take
toxic
so we'll blame Nietzsche for
femininity.
the toxic masculinity that he
No, maybe
stole
not. You
God.
can. You
He
can.
stole God from all these young men who need to understand better how to become fathers themselves.
I think actually as well, and it's misunderstood. Like I think Nietzsche had a great fondness of Christianity, and he saw great utility in Christianity. And the proclamation that God was dead was like a cry of a worry, or like a proclamation that was almost doomsaying, because
Yes.
God being dead, everybody loses their coherent value systems, then everybody is only out for themselves, and then you just,
Human sacrifice. See?
yeah, exactly, the end state, people lose their values, people are going to die, and it's going to be justifiable as well. It's even worse, justified killing for the greater good.
Right. Without Christianity, you end up with human sacrifice.
Yeah, and on that point, I think we can maybe wrap up, and we can have that be the recurring theme of the podcast. Rachel, it has been an absolute pleasure and a fascinating conversation. At least I thought so.
I did. Thank you for the questions.
Oh, great! Yeah, thanks for the discourse. So, folks, this is Rachel Fulton Brown. You can check out her blog at Fencing Bear at Prayer, and she's got a podcast again, which I forget the name of, which
Of Three Craters Symposium,
Three
which
Creators
is
Symposium
a
on YouTube.
discussion rather than just interviews, right? But we do have
Yeah,
guests
yeah.
as well.
Okay, yeah, I've watched it anyway. You have some great discussions and some fascinating people partaking in those discussions. So,
Thank you.
this has been episode 2 of the Social Dynamics podcast with me, CB Ahern, and with Rachel Fulton Brown, my guest. So, here we will leave you and bid you adieu.
you.